I first met Mark a couple of years ago at a meeting in London and was immediately impressed by his engagement, his enthusiasm and energy. And so when I found out he had founded a company, Precise Safety, focusing on safety culture, I thought it would be great to have him come in, give us a talk of his experience and interact with us over the course of today. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. I don't just thank Stephen for inviting me here today, but also giving me the chance for you to adjust somewhat to my Scottish accent. Coming from Glasgow, sometimes I feel that I don't speak to people. I need subtitles running along as I speak. So I hope I can filter that somewhat and engage you this morning in what is a rather personal story, but has some serious and much broader context. And I hope that I can engage your open minds in this story. This story begins in the part of the world where I'm from, in Scotland, but more specifically off the east coast of Scotland, close to Aberdeen, where this particular oil rig called Piper Alpha used to exist. And if we look a little bit closer at this platform, it looks like any other oil rig. If you've seen any, this will have been of no surprise to you. But on the 6th of July 1988, this oil rig changed from the image that you see here to this one. When after a series of safety lapses, a series of explosions turned the once vibrant and productive oil rig into this burning inferno. And the story doesn't just end with this platform and the fact that it was safety related. I want to engage you further with a story of two particular men who were on this oil rig at the time. When the first explosion hit at 10 p.m. in the evening of the 6th of July, the entire platform and those inside were plunged into darkness, exactly like this. Two men were in a gallery, a tea room, as they started their night shift when this happened. And one of those men at one end of the room, one end of this tea room, had a torch, but there was another man much further on the other side of the same tea room who was far more panicked about the situation. Reporting later, he would call himself a headless chicken. He felt so panicked that he couldn't really control how he was behaving. And the room got so warm from the fire so quickly that they could feel their faces starting to burn. This man who was so panicked here went into a fridge, and the only thing he could do to cool himself was take tomatoes and squeeze them onto his face. Such was the heat from this fire. And at one point, he thought that was it. And it wasn't until he saw this other gentleman with a torch that he was able to make his way over to him. And together, they were then able to try to negotiate their way off of Piper Alpha, off of this burning oil rig. So here's what it used to look like. When those men made it out of the darkness of the tea room, they weren't just trying to negotiate their way through various pipeworks and galleries and stairwells. They were having to ignore written procedures of where they should go. If they went where they should have gone, they would have died. But beyond that, they were also negotiating the fact that several of their colleagues had already tried to escape and been suffocated by the fumes of the fire. So they were trying to make their way through stairwells, but also more deeply over the bodies of their fallen colleagues. Their most impossible decision was this. Those two men, the man with the torch and the other man who was panicked, managed to get up to this helideck. And their impossible decision was, do we jump or do we wait here to die? Where it gets more important still is that the man who was originally panicked, counterintuitively, he was the one who managed to jump from the platform into the sea. That man with the torch that helped them both get to this position on the oil rig simply could not do it. He remained on the platform and died as a result. He couldn't bring himself to jump. So despite the fact that he was the one who helped them get there, he couldn't get off. These are images that you could very quickly Google online and see for yourself. But the reason that I tell this particular story, as I'm sure you're aware, this is among many process safety incident stories that could be told. But this one relates most with me because one of those men, the man who was panicked, the man who was able to jump from the helideck, was my father. And if we look at this a little bit further, there are many, many details about this that I could tell you that you could go and find out for yourself. There are books on this incident and others like it. But what I really want to do is to move away from everything that you could read about, to tell you something in the context more broadly of safety. This is a story of a man who was a foreman on an oil rig and was then plunged into a life to think about how to recover from burns like those you can see on his face. He also had very serious burns on his hands, to the point that he couldn't wash himself for weeks and weeks after this incident. He was relying on his parents to help him get by. I've said already, this is where the story might stop. You can find these newspapers and printings. But what I want to show you next are the things that happen over a much longer time when a safety-related incident like this happens. And what we have to think about when such things happen, but not only when such things happen, but how we, with our open minds on safety, can prepare and prevent such things from happening. Now, perhaps, if I can be quite frank, the more difficult parts of this story are still to come. And I mentioned at the start, if nothing else comes through here to you, the message is about the fact that all dominoes fall. Whenever we look at these safety incidents, there is a very serious temptation to look at the incident at a single point in time and to look at it as if it is one single domino in the face. But what I would argue is far more difficult for us in our human condition is to look in a much longer period of time, as if the accident itself is one domino and everything that happens afterward is all other dominoes behind that we don't look at right away. And so these details that I will share with you now are some of those other dominoes that fall after the Piper Alpha disaster itself and how it relates deeply to my life experience. Let me be even more frank. After this, you might not care about me or my father or anyone related to this. But I hope in our open minds you would all agree that this could be any one of us. So it's about thinking how we can behave together so that we can get home to our families and not have to tell stories about these dominoes falling one after the other. To bring it back to finish now, and I thank you again for your attention, to bring it back to this personal story that I've focused on, my last thanks is not from me, but my grandparents, my father's mum and dad, who you can see here around 30 years ago when I was a baby. And their thanks, I've told them about coming here and doing this sort of event. 30 years later, they were fortunate enough to meet my daughter. So I started my family just last year. And for them, they see their son, my father, living on through her now, and they feel indebted to, again, that man with the torch and the fact that my father was around and being a fantastic father for at least part of his life so that I could grow up the way that I have to then start my own family. So the final thanks is from them and not from me. So we end there. And again, I say, if everything has been broken through my Scottish accent, I hope this message of the fact that safety is one domino and an incident can be the start of many other dominoes falling. If you have questions or comments, I would be very grateful for them. I'd love to hear what you think. And one more time, thank you very much for your kind attention this morning. Cheers.